So we're tuning in a few minutes earlier just to give people time to get online and stream in. If you've tuned in, I'm trying something new today, so I can't actually see if people are watching. So if you've tuned in, please feel free to write in the comment section where you're tuning in from and who's tuning in. And we'll start in a few minutes. Oh, hi there. We've got Michelle. We've got Emma. Welcome. Hi there. We'll just wait for a few. Oh, hello, Sarah. I'm probably not going to say hello to every single person that tunes in because, oh, wow, there's quite a lot coming in here. Hi, everybody. Wow, people tuning in now. From Harrow in Middlesex, Sheffield, Edinburgh, Watford, Lincoln, Huntingdon. Fantastic. So we'll start in a few minutes. Hi there from Bradford, Tomanisi. Holland Rose from Lincoln. Michelle from East Riding of Yorkshire. Joseph from Retford, welcome. Hi there. People are still tuning in, so let's give it a couple of minutes and we'll make a start. Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. Yeah, people are still tuning in. We'll give it 1 more minute or maybe 2 minutes. It's 1 minute to 3 according to my clock. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. If you're just tuning in, feel free to write where you're dialing. Oh, wow, there's loads down here. Crikey. Oh, hi, Amelie. Amelie, thank you so much for your rainbow story. Wonderful. Fantastic. I look forward to reading it a bit later on. Noah from Kent, Chloe from Cam and Chloe from Devon, Myla and Eva from Suffolk. I can't keep up. They're all flooding in now. Fantastic. Amazing. Right, we will make a start in 1 minute. If you're just tuning in, feel free to share who's tuning in and where you're tuning in from. Georgina from Ruislip, Northwest London. Tree, that's very good to hear. You're excited for today's video. Thank you. Isla from Bournemouth. Issa from Manchester. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Amelia and Lucy from Kent. Iris and Phoebe from Bournemouth. Betsy from Hampshire. Charlie from Sheffield. Hi, Anu. Thomas from Bishop Stortford. Ah, that's just down the road from me. Hi, Heston. Anna from Shrewsbury. Hi, Siobhan. Right, we will make a start in a couple of minutes. Paula, can't wait for this. Thank you. Hopefully it lives up to your expectations. Tree from Watford. Hi, Tree. Again, Ishneet from Heston. Madison from Manchester. Let's have a look. Ed from Surrey. You loved last week. Thank you very much. Kaylee from Wigan. At the ready. Fantastic, Kaylee. Caitlin McKenzie from the Wirral. Woody from Basingstoke. Right, people are still tuning in. but we will make a start in 1 minute, I promise. 1 minute. They're flooding in now. Woody from Basingstoke, John T and Henry from South Staffordshire, Ewan from Leighton Buzzard, Charlotte is joining for the first time. Welcome, Charlotte. Aliko from Friends of Cricklewood Library, welcome. Charlie from Maidenhead, Amber from Ashford, Reese from Kent. Sorry if I'm missing people here. Gregory from Reading, Hannah from Kingston upon Thames, Evie from Manchester, Ellis from Braffin. That is exactly where I live. So, hi, Ellis. Oh, right. So we're going to make a start. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I am recording these and putting them up on YouTube after, so I'm going to try and be a little bit more professional this week. As I'm going to try and not react as much to the comments, just so it kind of looks a little bit better on YouTube. So let's make a start. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm R.A. Powell. I'm a children's author, and welcome to the second workshop on creative writing for children. It's amazing that we have so many more viewers tuning in this week. Thank you so much from all across the country. Millie from Nottingham has just come in. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. And thank you to those of you who tuned in last week and are still here this week. A special thank you to you. To quickly summarize, this is a 6-week course designed to help children to improve their creative writing. And I said it last week, I'll say it again, and I'm going to say it in every single workshop. Creative writing is all about enjoying yourself, expressing yourself, letting your imagination and ideas flow from your minds onto paper. It's something to do which should just be for you. Just do it for your personal enjoyment. Don't worry about what anyone else thinks about your writing. Last week, we covered characterization, which is the process of creating characters. If you haven't yet watched it, you can check it out on my Facebook page or on my YouTube channel. So at the end of this workshop, I'm actually going to announce details about the Rainbow Writing Competition. Many of you have already started on your 1,000 word stories, which is fantastic. Thank you. So I'm going to be announcing details around how that will work towards the end. So please stay tuned for that. But first, we're going to discuss all things settings. So the setting is the environment in which the story is told. So it could be a place, it could be a town, a village, a planet, a country. It could be a whole other mystical land that you have created. It could be a dream. And in our stories, there are often lots of different settings. So in our stories, we may move from one location to another. And similar to some of the themes we discussed in the characterization workshop, again, our job as an author is to bring our setting to life. We want to transport the readers into the world which we have created. So we have basically got them into our story so they feel like they're actually there. And today we're going to cover 3 main areas which you can think about when you're creating settings in your story. So like I said last week, take lots of notes. I hope you've got some paper and a pen, and take lots of notes, and you can always come back to your notes at a later date and use them when you're writing your story. So I'm going to list the 3 areas we're going to cover today, and then I'm going to go into more detail on each of them. So number 1 is to think about where the story will take place. So what location, what planet, what country. Number 2, we're going to talk about when we think whether the story will take place in the past, the present, or the future. So when does the story take place? So number 1 is where the story will take place, and number 2 is when. And then number 3 is how we describe the setting in detail. So again, how we can bring our settings to life for our readers. And we're going to cover that by talking about the 5 senses. So sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. And so that's what we're going to cover today. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each of those. So number 1, choosing a place, a location, a setting where the story is told. There are going to be activities today as well. So hang fire. There will be some activities where you're required to write in the comment section. And if you're tuning in after the live stream, you can take part in the activities just by writing down on a notepad. So let's go into number one, thinking about the place where the story is told. So choosing a location for your story is very important because it can give the story atmosphere. And actually thinking about where the story will take place can actually give you lots of new ideas for your characters and also the plot, the narrative. And we're going to cover plot and narrative in next week's workshop. You may decide that the setting may play a big part in how the story unfolds. So, for example, in my first book, Odd Socks, I've set it in the town of Socksville, and the people who live in Socksville and some of the locations within Socksville play a big part in how the story unfolds. So by thinking about the setting for our stories, it can give us lots of new ideas. You may decide that your story will take place in lots of different locations. If we're going to move around in our story between different locations, we've got to make sure that we keep the readers up to date with where we are. We don't want our readers getting confused on where the story currently is. So it could be a planet, a place, a village. It could be a whole other mystical land. You could have just one setting throughout the story which changes throughout the story. So, for example, you could start off with a nice picturesque village, which is calm and peaceful. And by the end of the story, there's been a storm, there's been a flood, it's dark, it's cold, it's scary. And so we want to, throughout that story, we would want to describe to the readers, you know, how that change has taken place and to keep them on that journey. What is really important is that when we decide on where the story will take place, it must sit comfortably with the characters and the narrative. So we want the characters to interact with the world around them, and the same with the story. And that's what we're going to kind of cover today. That's the key message today. We don't want our characters to be separate from the setting and vice versa. And the same with the story. We want them all to interact with each other. So let's have an activity. I think some of you have actually wrote down some settings here, so you've beat me to it. But this is, so basically we're going to have one activity today with 3 parts. So this is the first part. Please, can you give me an example of where a story could be set? And you can just write it in the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube or after the live stream, you can write it down on some paper. So an example for me, I would choose a seaside town. So my story would be set in a seaside town. Fantastic. So they're coming through now. London. I don't know if that's the location or where Jane is dialing in from. Brooklyn, New York, from Imogen. Fantastic. A palace, a haunted house, a dangerous forest, a school, a cloud. Fantastic. So just by, you know, I'm reading all of these locations now on the screen, and immediately my mind is thinking, wow, I could get so many ideas from those locations. So a forest, think of the world of possibilities that you could write for a story if it was set in a forest or a circus. So a village in the jungle, fantastic. Fantastic from Sarah. So just by thinking about where the story is set is a good thing to do, because it will help you to come up with new ideas for your story. So we're going to come back to this. Keep them coming in. They're still coming in. My mother-in-law, Kim, hi Kim, in a haunted forest, very, very scary. Thank you, Kim. So we're going to come back to that activity in a second. So basically what we've covered there is just the thought process around selecting where our story will take place. Now we're going to cover number 2, is to think about whether our story will take place in the past, the present, or the future. A lot of stories don't necessarily, a lot of books that you may have read don't necessarily reference a particular time or year. So you could say they're set in the present, but a lot of books are set in the past or the future. So we're going to talk about all three of those now, and some of the things that we need to think about. So if we were to set our story in the past, then we've got to make sure that our story makes sense. So for example, if we set our story in the 1700s, so 300 years ago, then the characters that live in the story wouldn't necessarily have computers or mobile phones or TVs. They wouldn't have technology like we do now. So we've got to make sure that if we do set our story in a time period, we've got to stay true to that time period. And we can do some research online to look at photos and do some reading around what it was like to live in the 1700s. And then we can try and use some of that information to incorporate into our story. A good idea as well is to maybe read another book which is set in a similar time period, and that can give you some ideas around how another author has brought to life that era. So if we're going to set it in the past, do some research, whether it's a decade or whether it's a century, or whether you want to set it during the Jurassic period when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. You can do some research to make sure that you really try and describe that time period accurately, so the readers feel like they are there. If we're to choose to set our story in the present, a useful thing to think about is to try and avoid contemporary references. And by that, what I mean is to try and avoid referencing things that are popular right now. So it might be fashion or music or shops on the high street or restaurants or cafes, because in a few years' time, some of those things might not be popular. So, they might go out of fashion. And if someone reads your story in a few years' time, then it's going to look a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit out of date, a little bit of its time. So it's just something to think about. A classic example of an author who doesn't do this, and it's the reason why his stories are timeless, is the master himself, Roald Dahl. Think about Roald Dahl stories. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda. They could be set at any point in history. They're timeless because he rarely references things that were popular back then when he wrote those stories. So it's just something to think about. And if you wanted to set your story in the future, then really you have an unlimited number of options which you could describe in terms of your setting. No one can see into the future, so no one can question what it would be like in the future. So you can dream up the wildest ideas. You can create all sorts of technologies and innovations and really let your imagination run wild and really take your reader on a journey into the future. So let's go back to our original comments that we made for the activity. I would like you to reply to your own comment where you put a setting, an example of a setting, and I would like you to write under that whether it would be set in the past, the present, or the future. And if you choose the past or the future, please can you write what year or decade or century you would choose? Fantastic. So we're starting to see those come through now. So for me, mine is a seaside town, and I'm going to set it in the future. Fantastic. And the purpose of this exercise, this is part 2 of part 3 of this activity. And the purpose of it is just to, again, demonstrate how quickly we can come up with a setting, just like we did last week with a character, with objects. We can come up with a setting, and then we can think about where the setting, when the setting would be, so the past, the present, or the future. And very quickly, it starts to give you thoughts, ideas, feelings, emotions, connotations in your mind around what it would be like at that setting, at that time. And then from that, we can start to generate ideas. So again, by writing, the process of writing this down, we then can feed in more ideas. And this is how we start to create, how we start to write. Wow. Paradise in the future in the year 3035 from Lorraine. Fantastic. Hopefully the world is still here in the year 3035. Fantastic. So Catland 1802 with advanced tech. So really, look at all of these fantastic ideas now. And this is how we start to build stories. So far we've covered what we need to think about when we decide where the story will take place, and also what we can think about when deciding if the story will take place in the past, the present, or the future. Now, what we're going to cover is how we bring that to life for the reader, how we can describe the setting, the environment, the time period in detail for the reader. So again, we transport the reader into the world we have created. We can do that through a number of ways. We can use the weather. The weather is always a great way to build atmosphere in a story, or build mood in a story. If it's dark and stormy and rainy, it can fit with the character's mood at that moment in time. If it's sunny or it's the winter, all of these things can really build atmosphere. We can describe the setting to the reader, and we can use seasonal descriptions to the reader. So if it's autumn or the summer or the spring or winter, again, we can incorporate some of these things into our story just to build atmosphere. But what we're going to cover today is how we can describe the setting through our characters' experiences in the story. So I mentioned at the beginning, what we want to do in our stories is to connect our characters with the setting. So we want our characters to live and interact with the world that we're creating. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the 5 senses, so sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And I'm going to give you some examples, one for each, how we can do this through our characters' experiences. So bear with me if none of this makes sense. Fantastic locations still coming through. Very, wow, we've got like the year 90 trillion. Wow. I wonder what the world is like then, or the universe. So fantastic. Thank you so much for those still coming in. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we can describe the setting through our characters' experiences through the 5 senses. So let's start with sight. So here we want to describe to the reader what the setting looks like, but through the eyes of a character. And for those of you who watch the characterization workshop, I would like to welcome back Tony and Jenny, who are 2 random characters who I created last week purely for the purposes of an exercise. So welcome back, Tony and Jenny. So what we want to say here to the reader is we want to say that the room is dark and that Tony has walked into the room. So basically, Tony's in a dark room. So we could say in our story, Tony entered the dark room. Or we could say, Tony stumbled in the pitch black darkness. And do you see the difference? They're both 2 sentences, both saying kind of the same things, but they immediately get a different reaction from the reader. Because where Tony is stumbling, so he's reacting to the setting. It's pitch black darkness, so you can imagine he might feel anxious or scared or disorientated. So simply by connecting the character to do something in relation to the setting, instead of just saying it's dark, we're saying that Tony has stumbled in the darkness, and it makes such a big difference. So that's sight. Let's do hearing. So here we want to describe to the reader what it sounds like at this particular moment of the story. So in your stories, there may be a moment where there's a really loud sound like an aeroplane or an engine or a rocket ship, or there may be a moment where it's very quiet, and we want to describe that to the reader. So here we want to say, for the example I'm going to give, that Jenny is in a quiet room. So we could say, Jenny entered the room, it was quiet. Pretty straightforward. Or we could say, instead, Jenny's footsteps creaked loudly as she entered the room. So again, we've used Jenny's footsteps to connect with the setting, to give a sense of the quietness, the stillness. So again, we're just using the setting. We're using a physical aspect of the setting to convey to the reader the sound. Does that make sense? If none of this makes sense, then feel free to ask me any questions in the comment section or drop me a line after this in a private message or on my Facebook page. So let's move on to smell. So here we want to convey to the reader that there's a smell in the setting. So we could say Tony noticed a strong smell in the room, which tells the reader that Tony's in the room and there's a strong smell. Or we could say Tony gagged at the ghastly smell. Again, we've got a reaction from Tony to the smell. He's gagged. It's not a very pleasant smell. We can imagine what Tony must be feeling like when he's walked into that room. So do you see the difference? Next up, we have taste. So here we want to describe to the reader what something tastes like. And we can taste food, or we can taste the air. Sometimes, you know, when we walk outside into the fresh air, we can almost taste the blossom or the freshly cut grass in the air. And that's an example I'm going to use for here. So we could say Jenny walked along the seafront and could taste the salty air. And that's pretty straightforward. Or we could say Jenny smiled as she inhaled a gulp of salty air. It reminded her of when her parents used to take her to the beach as a child. So we've went a little bit beyond the call of duty there, if you like. We've added a little bit more. But what we've done is, again, we've included a reaction to the salty air from Jenny. So she's smiled, it's positive. She's inhaled the salty air. But also, we've kind of used the salty air as a symbol for a positive memory for Jenny, using the setting. And then finally, touch. So here we want to convey to the reader what something feels like in the story. So physically, it could be a wall, it could be the floor, it could be water. You know, what does it feel like for that character? So we could say Tony fell into the water, which is does exactly what it says on the tin. Or we could say Tony shivered as the cold, dirty water soaked him at once. And again, we've used the word shivered to get a reaction from Tony to the environment around him. So by describing to the reader what our characters are seeing or hearing or smelling or hearing or tasting, we can put the reader in our character's shoes and then describe the setting at the same time. I hope that makes sense. And so we can do this throughout our story. So you wouldn't necessarily want to do all of these 5 senses at the same time in a particular moment of the story. You would just want to have subtle references to the character's interaction with the environment around them throughout the story, just to build atmosphere and to build a sense of what it's like for the character at that moment in the story. So part 3 of the activity. So we've already created a setting. We've decided whether the setting is in the past, the present, or the future. Now, and you can take a little bit more time to do this, I would like you to write 5 words of how it would look, what it would sound like, what it would smell like, what it would taste like, and what it would feel like in terms of physical touch for your setting. So you can comment. So if you want to reply to your original comment, if you can find it, and write the 5 senses. So for me, my example was the seaside town set in the future. I could write bright, windy, fresh, salty, sandy. Fantastic. So they are now coming through. So the purpose of this activity is just, and you can do this at home, for your stories, you can think about your setting and what it would be like to be in that setting if you were there, if you were a character. So you could make a list, write down your setting, the setting of your story, and all of the different locations that are in your story, and then maybe write the 5 senses alongside each. So what would it look like? What would it sound like? What would it smell like? What would it taste like, if anything? What would it feel like if you were to touch it? So that's a good activity, because that can then help you when you're writing your stories, by just creating a sense of location and setting. I hope that makes sense. Some great ones coming through. Sound peaceful, smell delicious, horrible, desolate, silent, rancid, bile, rotten. Wow, some pretty strong ones there from Tree. Fantastic. So if you're watching this at YouTube, on YouTube or after the live stream, you can simply do this on a notepad. It's just a really good activity. But see how quickly you can all come up with ideas. And creative writing is often about instinct. You know, sometimes we've just got to put down on paper the ideas that come into our head. So there's no such thing as a bad idea. You're only writing it down on paper. It's not going anywhere. So never be afraid, never be scared to get your ideas down on paper. There's nothing to fear. And we can always build on these ideas in the future. So just to recap, I'm going to overrun by 2 or 3 minutes. Apologies. If you need to leave, please do. Just to recap what we've covered today, we've talked about how a setting in a story can be really important, and it can help build atmosphere and mood and help transport the reader into our story. And we can do that by thinking about 3 things. 1 is deciding where the story will take place. Number 2 is when the story will take place. And then number 3 is how we describe the setting to the reader through the 5 senses, through taste, touch, smell, hearing, and vision. So that's what we've covered today. I will answer any questions on this feed. And then if you've got any questions after, please feel free to ask. Before we finish, I just want to give you information on the 1,000 word story, the rainbow writing competition. So great to see so many of you have already started your stories. Thank you so much. For younger children, as I said last week, please don't worry about the 1,000 words. If you want to write 250 or 50 words or 500, just decide on the right word count for you. So the rainbow writing competition will be a competition broken down into different age categories. So there will be prizes for children under the age of 7, a prize for children aged between 7 and 9, a prize for children aged between 10 and 12, and a prize for children aged 13 to 16. If there are any 16 plus submissions, I can very happily create another prize for you. And we want to just encourage people to write. So a few people have asked me why a rainbow. I think it's pretty obvious now in rainbow. Not only are they beautiful and often a symbol of peace and hope, and they often come and arrive just after horrible weather and they with sunshine, but also during these very strange times when we're all having to stay at home, rainbows have been used as a symbol in people's windows and a way to celebrate our fantastic NHS. So that's why I've chosen a rainbow theme. So your story doesn't have to be about a rainbow. It just has to have a rainbow in it at some point. So it doesn't have to have rainbow in the title. It just has to have a rainbow in it. So I'm going to put all of this on my Facebook page, but essentially the submission deadline is Wednesday, the 6th of May at 3 p.m. There are 4 prize categories, which I covered earlier. You can submit your stories to my email address, which I'll put on my Facebook page. Each entrant will receive some detailed feedback on their entry, so they can use this to improve their creative writing. And then the winner of each category will win signed copies of my books, Odd Socks, See Your Child Executive Officer, and my third book, which is due out in a couple of months, Odd Socks, Make Socks Feel Great Again. So they're the prizes. I will sign them and I'll write a personalised message in them. I hope that's a decent prize. To be honest, it's quite hard going to the shops at the moment to think of a better prize than that. The winners will be announced on Wednesday, the 27th of May at 3 p.m. live on Facebook. I'm going to put all of that information in a Facebook post, and you can keep that. And so I hope to see lots of entries. You can write over 1,000 words if you want to, but not too much more than that. There is a skill and art into writing to a certain word count, because you've got to try and fit in the narrative and include everything in to a certain length and time. And that's a skill in itself. So you can go slightly over 1,000 words, but not too much more. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Incredible. Please join me next week when we will have our next session, which will be on plotting and narrative. And we're going to basically bring a lot of what we've already covered together. So characterization, settings, and how we can incorporate all of that into the story, how the story unfolds, a structure to the story, and the twists and turns that we can incorporate to keep our readers engaged and interested. So thank you so much for tuning in. Take care, stay safe, and see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.